In 1997, Crown Publishing in New York presented additional evidence that the Egyptians did not build the Great Pyramid with grunt slave labour dragging 20-ton, 90-ton and 200-ton blocks around the country on wooden sledges. To quote Peter Tompkins, author of Secrets of the Great Pyramid, Richard Noon's painstaking investigation into the lost technology of the sophisticated builders of the Great Pyramid of Giza helps to unravel the mystery of this geodetic and astronomic wonder, answering questions as to who constructed it, when, how and why. Just the manner in which the casing stones were cut to optometric precision and accurately placed and fitted without damage could not be accomplished today with the advanced engineering of our space age. Research by Noon also highlights the continued struggle of scholars against the pitted obscurantism of the local authorities who continue to block research into what must be considered the patrimony not only of Egypt but of humanity. Noon commences with what his research reveals about how the construction of the Great Pyramid began. When the builders arrived, they saw a rocky knoll and a plateau that the pyramids sit on today. The first thing they had to do was level off the construction site. The Great Pyramid is still level to within half an inch over its 13.5-acre base. That is quite extraordinary, far better than we do on our buildings today. The obvious way for them to have done this would have been for them to cut channels or ditches into the rock of the site, then fill those ditches with water and drill away the rock between each ditch, using the water in each trench as a levelling mechanism. However, the one thing that most TV shows do not show is that the builders left a large rocky hill at the centre of the construction site. The reason for that was so that the well shaft, which was dug through the rock hill to the bottom of the Grand Gallery and joins the descending passage underground to the Grand Gallery. What they had done was cut the one passageway straight down to the subterranean pit, referred to in Noon's book as the Chamber of Chaos or upside-downedness. This pit has a smooth ceiling, a rough floor and a hole in it, and a saucer-shaped bowl. In any event, we all know that water will seek its own level. So when you have your construction site to the stage where you have a tunnel which follows a tortuous path, and you have a shaft going down that joins up in an L-shaped connection with the descending passage, you can utilize water which would be poured down that shaft, filling up the subterranean pit, and at the same time the air that was in the pit would be compressed against the ceiling. Once the water compresses the air against the ceiling of the lower compression chamber or pit, it would force water back up the lower diagonal. At one time there was a hinged granite door that only opened inward and downward. Water rushing down there would go back up only until it hit this door or check valve, slamming it shut. Then water would be forced to rise up the well shaft, the purpose being to bring water to the centre of the construction site above. At least one of the blocks in the Great Pyramid weighed 300 tons. Today we don't have a crane on Earth that can lift 300 tons. The maximum lift for cranes is around 200 tons. Not only would a lift like that be difficult by today's standards, but position in the needed equipment could take more than a week to lift one block. Noon stated in the early 1930s, during the Great Depression, a tremendous inventor, Edward Kunkel, began studying how the Great Pyramid was built. A friend of his commented to him after hearing a lecture about the date and size of the stones used in the building of the Great Pyramid, "I bet a fellow could make $50 if he could figure out how it was done and write a newspaper article about it." Kunkel, in his autobiography, said that $50 was a huge sum of money back in the Depression. So this could have been his prime motivation. In describing this unique pyramid building theory, Noon said, "Kunkel examines every known means for lifting a weight. The phenomenal weight of the blocks that made up the Great Pyramid has boggled the mind of anyone who has studied thousands of years of stonemasonry." Today, people even speculate that advanced beings from outer space came down and built the Great Pyramid, or that at one time man had somehow learned to use the power of his mind to levitate the blocks into place. Now, either one of those may or may not be true. What Kunkel did was examine the 7 ways to move a mass, e.g. manually, or with the use of a wedge or screw, an inclined plane, a lever, gear wheels, or a pulley. One way was with the use of pumps and hydraulics or water power. In essence, Kunkel was making a list and using a process of elimination to see which method was actually used. Noon pointed out the flaws in mainstream thinking about pyramid construction. Most of us are brainwashed from seeing too many television specials where the orthodox Egyptologists have shown modern-day work as pulling with ropes, muscle and human sinew, a block of stone that weighed maybe a ton. You watch them and they have a tremendously difficult job moving a 1-ton stone. That is a small block compared to most of the blocks in the Great Pyramid, so it has no basis in reality when you talk about some of the blocks in the Great Pyramid weighing as much as a modern diesel train engine of 90 tons. Certainly it's a worthwhile point to note that if massive ropes or chains were used, there would be handling scars from dragging on the stone, but there are no such traces of either handling scars or a ramp massive enough to accompany these huge blocks. While orthodox Egyptologists remain mired in the worn-out cliché that, with enough people you can move anything, Noon describes a far greater degree of technological and engineering prowess and intelligence to the ancient Egyptians than the mainstream is willing to do. About the ramp theory, Noon had this to say: "The single ramp theory, the long ramp, was discounted because every time a level of blocks would be laid, you'd have to raise the level of the ramp. The ramp would be a mile long and would have to be raised every time you went up a level. The ramp would consume 4 times more material than the Great Pyramid itself." After this theory was discounted in the early days, a clever fellow came up with the idea that spiral ramps wrapped around the pyramid were used to drag the blocks up to a higher and higher level, 20 to 45 stories high. The ramps somehow stayed attached to the pyramid with some unknown type of superglue, but turning the corners with the large blocks of stone would have been quite impossible. Noon suggests examining what makes sense. Anyone who has been to the Great Pyramid will know you can still see some of the original casing stones. These are the stones that are cut in 5 planes: a top, a bottom, a back, 2 sides, and a slanted front cut at 51.51 degrees. Kunkel deduced that once the first 4 rows of those casing stones were put in place, you had a huge square into which you could introduce and impound water. Those casing stones would hold a pond covering the 13 acres inside of those blocks. Men would then be working waist deep in water. With a simple water lock at one corner, blocks could be brought into the work pool on a barge. One man would then walk in waist-deep water guiding a block which would be called a backup block that would go behind the row of casing stones, gently sliding it off the back of the barge to put it in place. The placement would be aided with a thin lubrication film of cement, 1/50th of an inch thick. This cement boggles the mind of stonemasons today because it was stronger than the stone it bonded together. This is how you can handle stones without leaving handling scars. By dragging precision-cut stones across miles of desert, you would chip them and there would be scars, but there are none on these blocks. By using water as your transport and setting medium, you simplify the process. When they wanted to go up higher, they would raise the level of the water that was impounded by the casing stones and add the new ones. After that, they floated in a second level of casing stones to be set on top of the first row. One thing that Kunkel noticed that others have not was that each of the joints or seams, which are so thin that you can't get a razor blade between them, is 35 square feet in area. This tight fit would make it leak-proof or waterproof. Once the next row was added, more backup blocks would be brought in. The Great Pyramid was built from the centre up using a hydraulic crane to lift and lower the level of the water in the work pool. How big a crane are we talking about? This hydraulic crane was powered by a chemical engine, as Noon describes. In most school books today they say that the Egyptians did not know how to make any metal but copper, which is very soft. Yet a piece of iron was blasted out of the interior of the Great Pyramid, and the fact that it was covered with cement prevented it from rusting away over the ages. We now know that the Bronze Age and Iron Age started way before Egyptologists theorize. With Kunkel's research, we know the Machine Age had already started. The ancient Egyptians used a chemical engine and a series of water locks to bring the stone up to the next highest course of construction. A chemical engine is something that uses a gas or fire, and this begins with a gas such as would be emitted from burning a bushel of wood. In the late 1700s, a man named Davidson found a little chamber, an opening at the very top of the Grand Gallery. This is what Kunkel calls the firing hole. As you climb up the inside of the Grand Gallery, remember that the well shaft connects with the intake of the Grand Gallery, and there is an opening in the well shaft, the grotto, that is about equal in height to the original entrance to the Great Pyramid. If you had nothing more than a bucket brigade pouring water through the entrance of the Great Pyramid, the water would rush down the descending passage, filling the subterranean pit. With the pit full, water would rise up the descending passage until stopped by the granite check valve. The compressed air in the pit, pushing against the water, would force the water up the well shaft into the grotto. From the grotto upwards, the well shaft is lined with stone. The very first pictures were taken by Piazzi Smythe of the interior of the Great Pyramid. You can see from the grotto up to the intake of the gallery, which is built to withstand atmospheric pressure, that the joints are so fine you can't stick a pin anywhere in between. What they would do to bring the water up higher from the grotto area would be to light a fire in this firing hole at the top of the Grand Gallery. The next step would be to lower the granite slabs in the antechamber. As the fire burnt in the Grand Gallery, that produced the same effect as burning a candle in a pie pan of water and placing a bottle over it. This chemical reaction would have the effect of pulling the water level up from the grotto to the top of the Grand Gallery. For those doing the experiment with the pie pan, candle and wide-mouth bottle demonstrating this effect, you will note that when you change the fuel, you double the amount of water that is sucked upwards. Now, while this experiment only fills the bottle about 1/3 of the way, Noon shows that the size of the fire and the ensuing chemical reaction will move a lot more water, plus the addition of pressure from the compressed air in the subterranean chamber goes up the well shaft. The water is again aided by the compressed air in the Queen's chamber, thereby making a second compression to push the water to a higher level. The difference in chemical reactions determined by what you burn is what caused George Washington Carver in 1934 to understand how Kunkel's pump worked. If you read Herodotus, the Greek historian, in 440 BC, he described that the Great Pyramid had a wall around it, and the whole construction site around the pyramid was filled with water. Herodotus further mentioned that there were 2 large pyramids built in a lake, and that there was as much of the pyramids above the surface of the lake as there was below the Great Pyramid, and would allow water to flow by gravity to the well in front of the Great Pyramid. If they used all of their 33 separate quarries, each quarry running 3 8-hour shifts per day with all their modern equipment, it would take 27 years just to get the stone out. They may have used wood and water to split the rocks at the quarry and get them into a block size. After that, the blocks could be floated into a special cutting pool. If you wanted to cut a block just as smooth as a baby's bottom, you'd start draining the water out of the pool. The weight and the pull of gravity would cause the block to start sliding down, repeatedly passing over many cutting members. When it finally reached the bottom, it would be cut as fine and smooth as the lens in your glasses. Then it would be taken out of that cutting pool by a barge and another stone brought in. You could cut it easily that way in an assembly line process. Kunkel was awarded a patent in 1958, but much earlier he'd built a small model of this pump after studying the diagram of the inside of the Great Pyramid. He said that after installing 2 check valves, he could move water through the pump. What are the odds, Noon queried, that an inventor like Kunkel could come along and copy the interior of one of the oldest buildings on Earth and add a couple of check valves and get a US patent on a new type of pump? This technology could be applied to help irrigate areas of the advancing desert, thus changing the climate and eventually making arid areas more habitable. However, research by John Anthony West, Robert Schoch and others has shown that a long time ago, between 7000 to 5000 BC, Egypt had a much wetter climate. The water damage done to the Sphinx may point to a different environment around the time construction was going on. The Great Pyramid is extraordinary for its intricate passageways and chambers and the high degree of workmanship required to build it. In 1993, German inventor, explorer, engineer Rudolf Gattenbrink created a robot that would travel the narrowest of passageways in the Great Pyramid. The exploits of this robot became the focus of TV specials but remained inconclusive, as an obstacle was discovered in one of the narrow descending passages. When Gattenbrink requested permission to journey beyond the problem area, the Egyptian Antiquities Organization, the Supreme Council of Antiquities, denied him permission. World Explorer asked Noon if the Egyptians were helping or hurting the further exploration and knowledge the pyramids have to offer. Noon commented, Zahi Hawass and Mark Lehner were shown these passageways under the Sphinx in 1980. The tunnels look the same today as the well shaft in the Great Pyramid. When Professor Schoch asked to go into the same areas later, the permission was denied. Hawass and Lehner gained access to a vast underground complex beneath the Giza Plateau in 1980. Why is it being kept secret? A huge water tunnel under the Giza Plateau was briefly made known, but no other information has surfaced about it. Even accredited scientists are not allowed in these apparently restricted areas. What have they found? What are they doing down there? Noon has verified that the printout indicated a chamber approximately 30 by 40 feet below the Sphinx. What was stored there? Hawass apparently keeps secret what he knows and will probably not talk. When he found out the West Schoch team was conducting these experiments, he worked quickly to cancel their open-ended permits and get them off the Giza Plateau after only 5 days of experiments. Fortunately, they discovered the chamber where America's sleeping prophet Edgar Cayce predicted it would be. In 1933, Edgar Cayce was asked how the Great Pyramid was built. The answer was, by the lifting forces of those gases. Cayce also said that the discovery of how the Great Pyramid was built would be made in 1958. That was the year Kunkel was awarded the patent for his pump.